Today, we are diving into one of the biggest questions in all of philosophy, a question that gets right to the heart of who we are. We're going to use John Locke's legendary essay concerning human understanding to see how he absolutely tore down a really powerful idea, one that had a grip on the world for centuries. Seriously, think about it for a minute. You know, that gut feeling you have about what's right and what's wrong? Or just the basic logic that a thing can't be a circle and a square at the same time? Were you born with that knowledge? Or did you have to learn it all from scratch? That is the huge debate John Locke waded into more than 300 years ago.
So let's meet John Locke. He wasn't just some stuffy philosopher. He really saw himself as an investigator. He had this great analogy. He said our understanding is like the eye. It lets us see and perceive everything else, but it rarely takes a good look at itself. So his mission was to turn the lights on and actually examine the mind itself.
And he laid out his goal with just incredible clarity. He wanted to literally map our minds, to find the horizon between what we can actually know for sure and what's just, opinion or belief. I mean, talk about an ambitious project, trying to figure out the absolute limits of our own understanding.
Okay, so to kick off this massive investigation, Locke knew he had to go head-to-head with the number one theory of his time, the idea that we're all born with certain knowledge pre-installed in our brains. This was the big myth he set out to take apart piece by piece.
Let's make sure we're super clear on this definition because everything else hangs on it. Innate principles are ideas that are supposedly built in, not something you learned from your parents or your teachers or from, living life. They're just there from the second you exist. And the way people talked about it was so vivid. The idea was that these truths were like letters printed on the mind, these perfect, crystal clear truths that your soul gets the moment it comes into being. It's almost poetic, isn't it? That's the powerful image Locke was pushing back against. So how in the world do you test an idea that big? Well, Locke starts with logic, with what he calls speculative truths. Basically, these are just fundamental statements about what is. And everyone thought these were the best candidates for being innate because, they just seem so obviously true. Now, the main argument for innate ideas was pretty straightforward. It was called universal consent. The supporters of this idea would say, look, there are some truths that literally everyone agrees on. How could that possibly happen unless we were all born with them? It sounds like a pretty solid argument, right? Well, Locke is about to poke some very big holes in it. So he picks the most basic, bedrock principles of logic you can imagine as his test cases. First, whatever is, is. Seems undeniable, right? And second, it is impossible for the same thing to be and not to be. Again, how could you even begin to argue with that? Surely these must be innate. And right here is where Locke makes his move, with a brilliant, deceptively simple question. Is the agreement on these principles truly universal? Does every single human being on the planet actually know and agree with these statements? The whole case for innate ideas rested on that one claim, universal agreement. But Locke's rebuttal was just devastatingly simple. What about children? Or what about people with profound intellectual disabilities? He points out that they have, and I quote, no thought, not an inkling of these principles. And just like that, the whole idea of universal consent completely falls apart. But Locke is not done yet, not by a long shot. After taking on logic, he turns his attention to an even messier area, morality. Are we born with some kind of built-in compass that always points to what's right and what's wrong? He comes up with a new test for this. He argues that if a moral rule were truly innate, it would have to be completely self-evident. You shouldn't need a reason why it's a rule, it should be its own justification. Asking why should sound as ridiculous as asking why a triangle has 3 sides. Locke uses a fantastic example here. Keeping your promises. Seems like a pretty universal value, right? But as soon as you ask why we should do it, people give all sorts of different answers. A Christian might say, because God commands it. A political thinker might say, because the government will punish you if you don't. An ancient philosopher might say, because it's the virtuous thing to do. The key point is, the justification always comes from outside the rule itself, and that means the rule is not self-evident, and therefore, it's not innate. And then Locke just unleashes this barrage of real-world evidence. He points to the horrific things soldiers do when they sack a town. He points to entire cultures that practiced things like abandoning infants. He even points to gangs of robbers who are only just to each other out of convenience, not some deep moral principle. His conclusion is just stark. If you travel the world and look at history, you will not find a single moral rule that hasn't been ignored or even celebrated as a virtue by some group of people somewhere.
So, you might be sitting there thinking, okay, this is a pretty interesting historical debate, but why does this actually matter to me? Well, this is where Locke's argument suddenly gets incredibly powerful and deeply political. He's about to show that this idea of innate principles isn't just some harmless theory, it's actually a dangerous tool.
Because think about it, if you can convince people that certain ideas are innate, that they're God-given or just part of nature's design, then you can declare that your principles are sacred. You can say they are built-in truths, and therefore they must never, ever be questioned. Locke basically lays out the entire playbook. Step 1. A leader or a teacher declares that their own pet doctrines are innate principles. Step 2. They demand that their followers just accept these ideas on pure trust, without using their own reason. Step 3. This encourages what he calls blind credulity. Step 4. All critical thinking gets shut down. And the final result, people become way, way easier to govern and manipulate. So for Locke, when you boil it all down, the belief in innate ideas is worse than just being wrong. It's actively dangerous. It's an excuse for being intellectually lazy, for stopping us from doing the hard work of actually thinking for ourselves. And it becomes a weapon for people in power to demand our unquestioning belief. By so completely tearing down the house of innate ideas, Locke cleared the ground for a revolutionary new way of thinking about the mind. Because if our knowledge isn't pre-installed, if it doesn't come from nature, then it has to come from nurture. It has to come from the outside world through our senses and all of our experiences. And that, well, that's a whole other explainer for another day. So we've seen Locke take apart the arguments for innate logic and innate morality. And we've seen him expose the real-world danger of just accepting principles without question. And all of this brings us right back to you. His 300-year-old investigation forces us to ask a very modern and very personal question. What's that one idea you've accepted your entire life as just the way things are? What's the one belief you hold that's so obvious, so fundamental that you've never ever stopped to ask yourself, why?